As we continue here, bullying and toxic masculinities have grabbed headlines in recent weeks, with multiple incidents making their way into the national dialogue through news reports and social media posts. Many of these reported incidents have happened in schools across the country. We speak right now to Dr. Melusi Dlamini, who explore the relationship between boys bullying and belonging in a quest to understand the violent initiation that boys undergo in schools. Dr. Melusi Dlamini, thank you for joining us this evening to give us some insight. So the term ukufikisana comes from isiZulu, for instance, and means testing each other's power. How does this cultural framing complicate our understanding of what outsiders might simply call bullying here?
Yes, thank you so much, and good evening. And thank you for just giving the context of ukufikisana, because it's not a new term. It's something that young men introduced to us when we worked with them on the study that we were conducting with them. And so when ukufikisana comes up, it shows us here that there's a social and a cultural dimension to violence, something that can be overlooked when we simply are wanting to talk about bullying, and when we want to reduce incidents of school violence to limited frameworks. So here, what we identified in our study is that schoolboys were using this term to show how they were becoming fully boys, how they were stamping their power and were trying to show younger boys how they need to act. And this is, although this was in KZN, we see correlations to what has been happening in the country recently.
Yeah. Your research explores how ukufikisana operates as a form of social regulation among boys. How does this process then shape their sense of belonging and hierarchy within the school environment?
So what we see here is that boys negotiate belonging using violence. And what we were surprised by is that the senior schoolboys who themselves spoke about having experienced violence when they were junior boys eventually become initiated into this school culture where they go from being a victim of violence into actually perpetrating violence. And because this is something that becomes normalized among schoolboys, it tends to escape the attention of the authorities, especially when the approach is top-down. And when we don't hear from the learners what they experience as violence or what they understand as violence. Because some of the incidents, when it's about being a boy, when it's about this, what you call toxic masculinity, it then means some practices become normalized and they don't get recognized as bullying, but they simply understand it as part of being a boy.
You've written about the deep social meanings that violence carries in these spaces. How do ideas then about toughness, respect, or even repetition, how do they contribute to the persistence of school violence?
So one of the key challenges here is the fact that young boys are not allowed to show vulnerability. They are not allowed to be weak. So a part of what becomes then a problem with these harmful practices is that they are expected to withstand this violence in order to prove themselves. And they are also expected to enact this violence on others, again, as a way to prove themselves. So a key element here is really to think about how to educate young boys to challenge these harmful practices, to challenge these harmful patterns that become normalized in their daily lives, particularly when we consider the amount of hours that young people are spending in the school environment.
Dr. Dlamini, what did you observe about the ways teachers and school staff interpret or even respond to ukufikisana? Do they tend to see it as harmless or harmless initiation, or as a form of violence that needs intervention?
once again, what I think was important with this current study is that we weren't particularly looking for this practice of ukufikisana. But when we asked the learners, what does violence look like in your school environment? It's then where they started to tell us about threats, where the younger boys are telling us about threats that they get from older boys, where there are even promises or possibilities of serious bodily harm. And because they do not want to be seen as telling on the older boys, which makes them more vulnerable, they sometimes find themselves unable to go and alert authorities. But at the same time, what is also emerging in the general scholarship is this idea of boys will be boys. So sometimes these skirmishes can be dismissed as just young people playing around, whereas these become serious over time. And I think one of the other compelling findings we find in the study is that there's a participant who says violence is not just what they do, it's also what they say. So I think there's this idea of violence always being a physical harming. And what we are picking up is whether it's bullying or even within this social cultural practice of ukufikisana, there's an emotional element to it. But of course, this is another thing about toughness where young boys, even young men, are not expected to then express these feelings of fear, these feelings of vulnerability. So they tend to be caught in this double bind.
So many of the boys you interviewed appeared to normalize violence as part of growing up. What approaches could then help schools challenge this mindset or even encourage alternative expressions of masculinity?
So I think one of the things that are emerging, especially in incidents where we are seeing incidents of bullying trending on social media, trending in popular media, is it's always a learner behind a cell phone where they are taking footage in a space that is beyond the eyes of authorities. What we also found here with my colleague, Prof. Ngidi, his particular study identifies, he uses visual methodologies. And we found in the data that when we allow learners to also become experts and equal stakeholders in studies and interventions that want to address school violence, they are then able to show us from different perspectives how violence happens and where it happens. And so I think an important element and an important starting point, which has been an oversight, is that we need to include the learners and hear also from them, and not only be responsive to these incidents of violence. And importantly, and I think one of the other things here, when we see the public outcry, there's clearly a need for community engaged, community driven responses, because as it's been repeated, schools are microcosms of society. And so there really needs to be a more wide-ranging approach in how we think about school violence.
One article highlights that existing safety frameworks often fail at the implementation stage. What practical or even structural changes could help schools then turn these policies into real, lived protection for learners especially?
So one of the important thing here really is to take the everyday experiences of learners seriously, and to create spaces where they really can be able to voice their concerns, and where they know that these can be taken seriously. Unfortunately, a lot of the incidences we've heard of recently by the time they come into the public sphere, it is at an extreme point. So clearly, we need to establish ways where we can start to respond. And there are, and perhaps to be fair, there are interventions that have been put in place. But clearly, there's a need to further these interventions and to ensure that the response is much quicker. But like I was saying earlier, schools in our communities are not unique. They are also going to reflect the realities outside. And so you do find, particularly with the study we worked on, which is in the Ink precinct or the Ink area in eThekwini. So that's Inanda, Newzroom, and Kwamashu. So we did find there, when you look at the SAPS stats for the country, there is a correlation between the high violence in the communities and the high violence in the schools. So we do also need to think about how we look at schools and school environments holistically.
You advocate for treating learners as equal stakeholders in anti-violence initiatives. What would that kind of a collaboration then look like in practice? And what challenges might it face in typical South African schools?
So I think that is a broader conversation, and we're also just careful to not reductively then come up with solutions. But I do think a key area here, like I was saying earlier, we need to think about how do we include and center learners in interventions and not problematize them or not pathologize them. I do think in how we tend to respond in most instances is to try and punish and try and sanction these learners, while certainly there are issues with exacting violence on other learners. But I do think there's an element of education. So it's a multi-pronged approach that needs to happen. Working, of course, and led by the relevant government department.
Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Melusi Dlamini from Rhodes University, sharing his reflections on ukufikisana and the complex relationship between crime, masculinity, and school violence. His research challenges us to look beyond punishment and discipline, but to also see how belonging, identity, and power shape the ways that boys relate to one another as well. To read more, visit The Conversation Africa and look for the article, Boys, Bullying, and Belonging, Understanding Violent Initiation at South African Schools.